I came home earlier than usual that Tuesday, the kind of early that feels like you're stealing time back from the day, because a client call had been cancelled and my head was buzzing from staring at code and threat models for 10 hours straight, and all I wanted was the normal quiet routine I'd built my life around: shoes by the door, leftovers in the microwave, maybe an hour on the couch before bed. But the moment I stepped inside the house I could feel that something was off in a way that had nothing to do with logic or pattern recognition and everything to do with instinct. Melissa was standing near the kitchen counter, not cooking, not scrolling on her phone, just standing there with her arms crossed and her posture stiff like she was bracing for impact, and when I said her name she didn't answer right away. She just looked at me with this flat expression that felt rehearsed, like she had already played the scene in her head and was waiting for her cue. On the couch was Kayla, curled into herself with her knees pulled up and her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking in exaggerated, uneven sobs that sounded wrong, too loud and too deliberate, but at the time I told myself not to judge because she was 19 and emotional and I was the adult in the room. I asked what was going on, slowly, carefully, because years of consulting had taught me that tone matters when people are already on edge, and that was when Kayla looked up at me with red eyes that were dry at the corners and a stare that was sharp underneath the tears, and she said my name in this broken voice and accused me of making her uncomfortable, of saying things I had never said, of looking at her in ways I never had, of walking into her room without knocking, of brushing past her in the hallway on purpose, of comments that were supposedly jokes but felt wrong, and each word hit me like a physical blow because none of it matched reality and yet it was being spoken out loud in my own living room as if it were a documented fact. I remember trying to laugh at first, not because it was funny but because my brain was desperately searching for a category where this made sense, maybe a misunderstanding, maybe something taken out of context, but Melissa didn't laugh. She stepped closer to Kayla and put a hand on her shoulder, and that was the moment I understood that this wasn't confusion, this was alignment. I tried to explain, calmly at first, then faster as the accusations stacked on top of each other, pointing out that I work from home and log every hour, that I barely leave my office during the day, that I knock on every door because that's how I was raised, that I have never once commented on Kayla's body or appearance beyond basic politeness, but every sentence I spoke seemed to harden the air in the room. And Melissa's face stayed cold and rigid, like she had already decided what version of reality she was going to accept. Kayla kept crying, louder whenever I spoke, quieter when I stopped, and I realized with a sick clarity that I wasn't part of a conversation. I was standing in the middle of an ambush, and the most terrifying part wasn't the lies themselves but how easily they were being believed, how quickly my normal day had collapsed into a situation where intent and truth no longer mattered. And I was suddenly very aware that no matter what I said next, the ground under my feet was already gone. Melissa didn't ask a single follow-up question, not one request for clarification, not one moment where she turned to me and said, "Tell me exactly what happened," because in her mind it had already happened, fully formed and beyond dispute, and the speed of that judgment left me stunned in a way I had never experienced before. The moment I tried to respond she cut me off and said I was gaslighting both of them, that the calm way I was speaking was proof that I was manipulative, that my insistence on logic and timelines was just another tactic, and it didn't seem to matter that my entire career was built around methodical problem-solving rather than emotional coercion, because suddenly every trait she had once praised in me was being reframed as something sinister. I told her I needed her to slow down, that accusations this serious couldn't just be accepted without talking through them carefully, that there was no evidence because there was nothing to prove, but she shook her head and told me that asking for proof was offensive in itself and that her daughter's word was all the evidence she needed. Kayla stayed tucked against her side, crying softly, and every time I tried to make eye contact with her she looked away as if I were the one violating a boundary just by being present. I remember feeling this growing pressure in my chest, not anger but disbelief, because I wasn't being heard at all. I was being managed, categorized, dismissed. And when I said that I loved Melissa and that I would never do anything to harm her child, she snapped back that love didn't excuse behavior and that abusers always deny what they've done, a sentence that landed like a verdict rather than a concern. I asked if we could sit down and talk through each claim one by one, dates, times, specifics, anything that could anchor this conversation to reality, but she told me she wasn't interested in debating my daughter's trauma. And in that moment I understood that there was no defense I could offer that wouldn't be twisted into further proof against me. She straightened her shoulders and said that as a mother her responsibility was clear, that her daughter came first no matter what, and that if there was even a chance I had crossed a line then I didn't belong in that house anymore. The word chance echoed in my head because it meant guilt by possibility, and before I could process it she told me to pack a bag and leave immediately, not tomorrow, not after cooling down, but right then, as if my presence itself had become dangerous. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, trying to reconcile the woman I had married with the one ordering me out of my own home without a conversation, and when I realized she wasn't going to look at me again, that her body was already turned away, I felt something inside me shut down completely, because being accused was one thing, but being erased without being listened to was something else entirely. I didn't even get the dignity of packing my own things, because when I moved toward the bedroom Melissa stepped in front of me and said I wasn't taking anything except my keys and my wallet, her voice sharp and controlled like she was reading off a policy rather than throwing her husband out of the house, and when I protested that I needed clothes, my laptop, basic necessities, she told me that if I tried to take anything else she would call the police and explain why she felt unsafe. She added, almost casually, that if I attempted to contact Kayla in any way, directly or indirectly, she would pursue a restraining order, and the way she said it made it clear that this wasn't a threat born of fear but a strategy already considered and prepared. I stood there in the entryway holding my keys like they were proof I still existed, listening to Kayla sniffle behind her, and it was in one of those strange suspended moments, when Melissa turned to grab her phone, that I saw something I can't unsee, because Kayla's crying stopped instantly, her face going neutral in the span of a second, her eyes flicking up to watch me with a calm, assessing look that had nothing to do with distress, and then the tears came right back the moment Melissa turned around, as if someone had flipped a switch. My stomach dropped, not with relief, but with the sick understanding that this wasn't just a misunderstanding spiraling out of control, it was deliberate, and I was already too far gone in their narrative to point it out without sounding exactly like what they decided I was. I opened the door without another word because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make things worse, and as I stepped outside the house that I had paid for, repaired, protected, and thought of as home, the door closed behind me with a finality that felt unreal, like a scene change that hadn't been earned. I sat in my car for a long time before I could even start the engine, hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Kayla, every hallway pass, every conversation, desperately searching for some innocent action that could have been twisted, but coming up empty, and the emptiness was terrifying because it meant I had no control over what had just happened or what might happen next. The only person I could think to call was Mark Reynolds, a friend I'd known for over 15 years, someone who had watched my marriage from the outside and knew my habits, my boundaries, my flaws, and when I told him what was going on my voice finally cracked in a way it hadn't inside the house. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask me what I might have done wrong, didn't play devil's advocate, he just told me to come over immediately and that I could stay as long as I needed, and when I arrived he took one look at my face and said he believed me without qualification. Sitting on his couch that night, wearing the same clothes I'd left the house in, I felt hollowed out and numb, but for the first time since walking through my front door earlier that day, I wasn't alone with the weight of what had just happened, and that small fact was the only thing keeping me upright while everything else in my life felt like it had already collapsed. I didn't sleep at all that night, not in any meaningful way, because every time I closed my eyes my mind dragged me back through the last several years like a corrupted video file, skipping, looping, replaying moments I had never questioned before and now couldn't stop dissecting. I went over every interaction I had ever had with Kayla, every time I'd said hello in passing, every family dinner, every holiday, every time I'd been alone in the house while she was in her room, searching for something, anything, that could remotely resemble what she'd accused me of, but the more I searched the clearer it became that there was nothing there, no inappropriate comments, no lingering looks, no boundary crossed even accidentally, just normal coexistence that had somehow been rewritten overnight into something unrecognizable. By the time morning light crept through Mark's living room windows, the confusion that had paralyzed me the day before had hardened into something else entirely, a cold, focused awareness that disbelief wasn't going to protect me and that pretending this would resolve itself was a luxury I no longer had. I realized that whether the accusations ever went further or not, the damage was already real, and if I didn't take control of the narrative in the only way I knew how, through documentation and precision, I was going to be crushed by it. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started writing everything down, dates, times, conversations, even mundane routines, noting when I worked, when I left the house, when Melissa and Kayla were home, building a timeline not because I expected someone to read it immediately but because I needed to anchor myself to facts before the lies blurred everything beyond recognition. I pulled phone records, saved text messages, archived emails, took screenshots of calendars and work logs, and wrote the names of people who could verify where I'd been at specific times, coworkers, clients, neighbors, anyone who might matter later, and the act of doing it was the first thing that made my hands stop shaking. Around midday I called a family law attorney named Daniel Brooks, my voice measured but tight as I explained the situation, and he didn't interrupt me once, which alone felt like a gift after the night before. When I finished, there was a pause on the line, and then he told me plainly that false accusations of this nature were serious, that they had a way of escalating quickly, and that waiting passively was one of the most dangerous mistakes people in my position could make. He explained that even without formal charges, the allegation itself could be weaponized through restraining orders, custody claims, or social pressure, and that the goal wasn't to prove my innocence in some abstract moral sense but to protect myself legally before someone else decided my guilt for me. He advised me to continue documenting everything, to limit communication, to avoid emotional reactions that could be misrepresented, and most importantly, to act first rather than spend my energy hoping for fairness. When I hung up the phone, the weight of what he'd said settled in slowly, because it meant accepting that this wasn't a temporary crisis or a misunderstanding that would clear up with time. It was a situation that could define the rest of my life if I let it, and for the first time since being thrown out of my house, I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was thinking in terms of strategy, not because I wanted conflict, but because protecting myself had become the only rational option left. Acting on Daniel's advice, I filed for divorce within days, not because I wanted the marriage to end but because waiting would have handed control of the situation to someone who had already shown she was willing to decide my guilt without listening, and once the paperwork was submitted I cut off all direct contact with both Melissa and Kayla, limiting everything to attorneys and documented channels only. The silence that followed was unsettling at first, but it was also clarifying, because it gave me space to think without being emotionally dragged back into a version of events that wasn't real. About a week later the phone calls started, first from unknown numbers and then from Melissa's own, and against my better judgment I listened to the voicemails, noticing immediately how her tone had shifted from the icy certainty of the night she threw me out to something sharper and more controlled, anger wrapped in concern, telling me I was overreacting and destroying the family over a misunderstanding. When that didn't get a response, her tone softened into something patronizing, explaining that I was clearly under stress and not thinking straight, that filing for divorce was extreme, and that adults worked through uncomfortable situations instead of running from them. By the second week, the messages took on an almost benevolent quality, as if she were offering me a lifeline I didn't deserve, saying she was willing to forgive me, willing to move forward, willing to consider counseling if I would just take responsibility for my actions, apologize to Kayla, and acknowledge that I had crossed boundaries even if I hadn't meant to. The implication was clear in every word she chose, because there was no path back that didn't require me to accept guilt for something I hadn't done, and hearing her frame it as growth or healing only reinforced how dangerous agreeing to that narrative would be. I didn't respond emotionally or defensively, because I understood now that every reaction could be reframed, so when I finally replied it was brief and measured, telling her that I was willing to meet and discuss matters face to face, but only under specific conditions that protected me. I made it clear that the meeting would take place in a neutral public setting, that it would be scheduled in advance, and that there would be no surprises, no confrontations, and no attempts to force an admission disguised as reconciliation. She agreed almost immediately, too quickly, as if she were relieved to have regained a sense of control, and as I confirmed the details I felt that strange mix of calm and tension that comes from knowing you are walking into something calculated, not to fix the past but to prevent it from being rewritten any further. Melissa arrived looking like someone preparing to repair something fragile, carefully dressed, hair done, makeup soft, the kind of presentation meant to signal openness and regret without ever actually saying the words, and when she saw me already seated she smiled cautiously as if expecting an apology to follow the moment she sat down. What she didn't expect was Daniel sitting beside me, calm and professional, his briefcase placed deliberately on the table between us like a boundary that couldn't be crossed, and the moment her eyes registered him the smile faltered in a way that was almost imperceptible but final. I didn't raise my voice or change my expression when I introduced him, and before she could steer the conversation back to counseling and forgiveness, Daniel slid the documents across the table with a steady hand and told her she was being formally served. The color drained from her face instantly as she flipped through the pages in disbelief, repeating that this was a misunderstanding, that this wasn't necessary, that we could still talk this through like adults, but every word sounded hollow against the legal weight of what was in front of her. Kayla, who had been sitting beside her with her arms crossed and eyes downcast, started breathing faster as the reality of the situation settled in, and when Melissa turned to her for reassurance, something shifted. Kayla's composure cracked completely and she broke down in a way that was different from before, messy and uncontrolled, her voice shaking as she admitted that she had lied, that she had made everything up, that she never thought it would go this far. She said she believed that if she accused me, her mother would finally choose her completely and that maybe, somehow, it would force her parents back together the way things used to be, and as the words spilled out it was painfully clear how little she had understood the consequences. Melissa stared at her like she was hearing a foreign language, her hands trembling as she tried to reconcile the story she had defended so fiercely with the confession unfolding in front of her, and the realization hit her slowly, piece by piece, that she had refused to listen when it mattered, that she had chosen certainty over truth. She looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time since that night, and whatever she saw there finally made it impossible to deny what she had done, but by then it didn't matter, because the damage had already been done and the truth, when it finally arrived, came far too late to change anything. The moment the truth was out in the open, Melissa collapsed into a version of herself I hadn't seen in years, crying openly, apologizing over and over again, reaching for my hands as if physical closeness could rewind time, telling me she'd made a terrible mistake and that she'd been blinded by fear, that she should have listened, that she would do anything to fix this if I would just give her the chance. She talked about counseling, about family therapy, about starting over, about rebuilding trust as if it were something that could be reconstructed once the facts were corrected, but as I listened I realized that the lie itself wasn't what had broken us beyond repair. I told her calmly, without anger, that what ended the marriage wasn't Kayla's false accusation but her response to it, the speed and certainty with which she chose a version of events that cast me as a threat without asking a single question, the way she treated me like a criminal in my own home and erased years of partnership in a single night. I explained that trust isn't just about believing someone when things are easy, it's about how you handle doubt, and when doubt appeared she didn't hesitate, she didn't investigate, she didn't protect both her child and her husband, she sacrificed me without a second thought and then justified it as motherhood. I told her that being thrown out of my house with nothing but my keys, being threatened with legal action for defending myself, and being spoken about as if I were dangerous had changed something in me that couldn't be undone by apologies or promises. She kept saying she hadn't known, that she'd been manipulated, that she would never make that mistake again, but the problem was that she had already shown me exactly who she was under pressure, and that knowledge doesn't disappear once it's gained. There was no satisfaction in saying no, no sense of victory, just a quiet certainty that going back would mean accepting that my safety, my reputation, and my dignity were conditional, and I couldn't live like that. Days later, through attorneys, she signed the uncontested divorce papers without a fight, and when I saw the confirmation come through I didn't feel relief so much as a heavy, sober finality, because the truth had come out, but it hadn't restored anything, it had only clarified that what was lost wasn't the marriage itself, but the illusion that it had ever been as secure as I believed. Months passed in a way that felt unreal at first, like my life had been quietly rerouted while I wasn't looking, and when things finally settled I found myself in a new place, literally and figuratively, a smaller home that was entirely mine, quiet in a way that felt intentional rather than empty. My work didn't suffer the way I once feared it might, because when the noise was gone I focused harder than ever, my business growing steadily as I poured my energy into something that couldn't be taken from me by accusation or assumption. I rebuilt my routines, not out of stubbornness but out of respect for myself, cooking again, sleeping through the night, trusting my own memory without replaying it for errors, and with each passing week the constant vigilance faded into something like calm. I heard through distant channels that Kayla had moved out, that whatever version of reality she had built to justify what she did couldn't survive once it was exposed, and knowing that didn't bring me satisfaction so much as closure, because it confirmed that the lie had never been about me at all. Melissa, I was told, lived alone now, surrounded by the consequences of choices she could no longer reframe or apologize away, and I didn't dwell on it because I no longer needed to. When I ran into her unexpectedly one afternoon, crossing paths in a grocery store aisle of all places, there was a brief moment of recognition and hesitation, her eyes searching my face for something I wasn't offering anymore. I noticed, almost clinically, that I felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, no urge to explain or defend or relive what had happened, just a quiet neutrality that surprised me more than anything else. We exchanged a polite nod, nothing more, And as I walked away I realized that peace isn't dramatic or triumphant, it's subtle, it's the absence of weight you carried for so long you forgot it wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't need revenge, I didn't need vindication beyond the truth already established, because choosing myself, choosing dignity over desperation, had been enough. Walking away clean hadn't been easy, but standing there months later, untouched by the past and unpulled by it, I understood that it had been the only ending that ever made sense.